Welcome all, and thank you for joining us for our special Experience the Battle of Princeton event. My name is Will Krakower. I am the historian here at Princeton Battlefield State Park. And on behalf of Princeton Battlefield State Park and your New Jersey Park Service, we are very pleased to introduce our eminence, our historian, our author, Larry Kidder. For those of you who are attending the event on the 2nd, Larry will be the one walking you through our reenactment. For those of you who are simply joining us online, welcome. And we are very pleased that Larry has agreed to give us an introduction to the 10 crucial days and ultimately leading us to the Battle of Princeton. So without further ado, Mr. Kidder.
Okay, thanks very much, Will. When talking about the Battle of Princeton, I think it's very important for people to start with the question, why was there a battle at Princeton? What was going on that the two armies got together there and shot at each other for a while? We know, I think, that it was an extremely important battle, and more about that a little later on, but it did kind of turn around what was going on in the revolution at that time for the better for our side. And I think that understanding not just the actions on the battlefield, but everything that led up to it, which answers the question, why was there a Battle of Princeton? Meaning, why in Princeton? Why not somewhere else? Why January 3rd and not some other day? I think those are important questions. To get a start on the background, we need to consider that the Battle of Princeton, coming on January 3rd in 1777, was at the tail end of a long year of combat between the British and the American armies. A lot of that had taken place around New York and what we call the New York Campaign of 1776. There were several battles. The Battle of Brooklyn in late August of 1776, the Battle of Harlem Heights in mid-September, and then the Battle of White Plains in late October. So you see, we got several months of activity going on there. And notice that we're going further away from New York City with each battle. And that's because Washington is kind of retreating and General Howe is keeping the pressure on. After the Battle of White Plains, Washington crosses over to New Jersey, feeling that he has got to get between the British Army and Philadelphia to prevent the British from closing the year of warfare by taking Philadelphia. So Washington retreats across the state of New Jersey. And of course, the British aren't just going to let him walk. They're going to, follow after him and keep, a certain amount of pressure on. It's not a wild running retreat. It does take a while, but it's definitely a consistent retreat. And at this point, by December of 1776, this map shows General Washington's forces in the left-hand side of the Delaware River there. He's crossed over. He crossed at Trenton about the first week of December, got across by December the 8th. And the British, following behind him, then went into winter quarters at the various locations you see on this map that are highlighted by showing the regiments that were stationed at them. So you see that the British are scattered all over the state of New Jersey. And in fact, this very rough and just symbolic coloration shows the part of New Jersey that they basically controlled. Notice there are a few American troops up at Morristown, and they are going to be joined by the main American army after the Battle of Princeton, and more about that later. Now, why attack on December 26th? and this is Trenton again, not Princeton. Well, on December 25th, they'd been fighting really since April, excuse me, April 19th, 1775, with Lexington and Concord. And then certainly after independence was declared on July 2nd, 1776. So they've been fighting since July for independence. Really, before that, they were fighting to redress their grievances with Great Britain. Although certainly a number of people did want independence even earlier. Now in December, the British occupy so much of New Jersey, as we saw on the map just a second ago. The New Jersey state government, that is the rebel government or the patriot government, is not functioning. The men who serve in that government are, very many of them, out of the state or in remote parts of the state where they can avoid capture by the British and imprisonment, hanging, or whatever might befall them. So by early December, by this last week of December in the 20s, we have the American crisis in detail, what we can see. Thomas Paine's statements about these are the times that try men's souls, etc. He's really saying the revolution is just about over unless we can get together and turn things around. And most of the Americans would have agreed with him that it was getting close. And the British would have agreed that they were just about winning. If the British were upset about anything, it was that Howe hadn't moved quickly enough to end the whole thing in the first year, and now they might have to go a few more months. But they were very confident. However, you saw those encampments in the map before with all the red lines between them. Those cantonments were vulnerable to Washington. Washington's army, as small as it was, and more about that in a second, he outnumbered the British in any of those cantonments. His problem would be if they all got together, then he would be severely outnumbered by the British. But so long as he might look at them as a chain of dominoes, if he could knock them off one at a time, he might be able to accomplish something. Because of the British occupation, the patriots in New Jersey feel unsupported. Many of them are signing loyalty oaths to the king again. This was offered by General Howe, and because of the situation in New Jersey, people were, whether they really wanted to or not, were signing the papers. The loyalists, on the other hand, feel empowered and emboldened. They want to take back the state from the patriots. The patriots had not treated the loyalists very well when they took control after the Declaration of Independence. Now the loyalists want to get some revenge. The Continental Congress does not feel secure, even with Washington between it and the British Army. So they've relocated to Baltimore, Maryland from Philadelphia. Washington is in the situation on December 25th that he must restore security and a sense of security to those citizens who support the revolution. Washington's army has shrunk from about 20,000, and these are all very kind of speculative numbers. We don't have exact figures, but this is a ballpark. Had shrunk from about 20,000 to about 2,800 Continental troops, but also some militia. But the militia are kind of coming and going. It's not something that he feels he can really count on. Many of the enlistments of those few Continental troops that he has expire on December 31st. The war was supposed to be over in December of 1776, and therefore the men who enlisted, many of their enlistments were scheduled to end because the war would have been ended, theoretically. This army that Washington has had sporadic pay, food, clothing, and equipment. The men are not real happy because they haven't been paid. They kind of signed a contract when they enlisted, and their part of the contract was to fight diligently in the army, and the Continental Congress and their state governments were responsible for the pay, food, and clothing and equipment for them. Well, the men felt they had fulfilled their part of the bargain, but the government had not fulfilled their parts completely. So they're not real happy, aside from the fact they've been going through war, disease, now cold weather, etc. For the past 2.5 weeks, the soldiers have been encamped on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, and some men in structures, barns, things like that, some in tents, although the tents were in pretty bad shape by this point, and many of them were just sleeping in the open. So they're really uncomfortable, and they've been there for several weeks. Like I say, this is not helping the illness problems. It's not helping the gaining strength again from the long campaign season. It's really, the Army is still in danger of going downhill even further. There is a new Army being constructed, authorized by the Continental Congress a couple of months earlier. And they want to now have the soldiers enlist for 3 years or more. Very often it was phrased as 3 years or the duration of the war. Now, how are you going to get men to enlist in this Army, this new version of the Continental Army, if they don't believe that Washington can lead them to ultimate victory? Again, these are the times that try men's souls. People are not optimistic. It's going to be tough to get recruits going. So again, Washington needs to do something to get the morale up of potential recruits for his army. At the same time, on December 25th, down in Trenton, there's about 1,500 Hessian troops. Notice Washington has between 2,000 and 3,000. There's about 1,500 Hessian troops there. This is one of those cantonments that Washington outnumbers the men in that cantonment. And if he can attack them in a surprise attack and avoid British troops from other cantonments coming in to help them, he will have the advantage of numbers. These Hessians are good soldiers. Don't want to belittle them at all. The position they're at in Trenton is a position of honor in that string of cantonments. And it was given to them because of their outstanding performance in the New York campaign, particularly at the fall of Fort Washington and at battles like White Plains. The Hessians are tired and sick, just like the Americans are. We know about the Americans lacking shoes in some cases. Many Hessians were also lacking shoes. We know that the American uniforms were all beat up and maybe had never been complete anyway. And the Hessians, even though they've got a better supply system, they're still not in the best of shape in terms of their clothing. Colonel Rahl, who is their commander, made several mistakes. Number one, in fact, both of these mistakes center around his inability to recognize any quality in Washington's troops. He believes that they're going to be easily defeated. So he doesn't build any defense positions at Trenton, and he doesn't give his officers orders about where to form up, what actions to take if the town was ever to be attacked. So the Hessians are going to be somewhat taken by surprise, but they are spread throughout the town. It's going to be very hard for them to get together and defend this town because they're living in so many different houses, so many different buildings. And you remember that we're talking about verbal communications here, maybe some drums, that kind of thing. But the communication system is not going to be what we are used to today. We also need to know that the Hessians had dependents, just as the American Army and the British Army had camp followers, wives of soldiers, etc., merchants who wanted to sell the soldiers food and things like that to supplement their rations. And even some of their children were with them in Trenton. And some loyalists, because they wanted to help these Hessians and protect them from the Americans, they've come into town also. And we believe that these dependents and the loyalists were actually living at the old barracks in Trenton. And the old barracks often get portrayed as the location where the Hessians were stationed when Washington attacked. But in point of fact, you can see from here, they're all over the place. And it's their wives and kids and civilians that are in the old barracks, the fortified building. The Hessians literally expect a long winter of being harassed by Washington's troops. This is going to be one of the things that helps Washington surprise them. They don't expect a major attack. They expect 40 soldiers, 50 soldiers, small groups who are going to attack them, as they have been for the past series of weeks. Just to show you some arrows on the map here, just above Trenton as well as below Trenton, these groups of 40, 50 men would cross over. They would attack Hessian work parties, forage parties, guard posts, things like that. The Hessians were taking casualties, as were the Americans. They were fighting at least some kind of a skirmish almost every day. To the far south of Trenton, and you see this arrow coming from Philadelphia, Colonel Griffin, Virginia colonel, with some New Jersey militia, was causing all kinds of action for the Hessians that were stationed south of Trenton under Colonel Von Donop. And between these two locations of daily attacks, that's what's giving the Hessians the idea that this is what they're going to put up with the rest of the winter. Now, Washington's plan to attack Trenton involved multiple attacks. He's going to cross Johnson's and McConkey's Ferry. General Ewing, with a number of militiamen, is going to cross the river south of Trenton. Colonel Cadwalader, with some Continental troops as well as militia, Pennsylvania troops, is going to cross at Bristol. And General Putnam, he believes, can bring some troops across from Philadelphia. All of this is going to be a surprise, again, because the Hessians are not going to be expecting this big an action. Washington also is going to rely on artillery. He has become very interested in artillery because of Henry Knox in these weeks leading up to the Battle of Trenton. And Knox has convinced him, meaning Washington, of the value of the artillery. Now, when he's going to cross at McConkey's Ferry, we all know that he used Durham boats, and the painting of him crossing really doesn't show any kind of accuracy of these boats. It looks more like a rowboat, and it looks a little unstable with Washington standing in it. But look at the photo just to the right of that with a portrayer of General Washington standing and all of his troops standing. Nobody's sitting in this boat. They are very well constructed, very heavy duty boats. And so if you have people that kid you about Washington standing in the rowboat, keep the image on the right here in mind rather than the image of the painting. Washington also needed ferry boats to cross. And you can see here several paintings of artists trying to show the ferry boats as opposed to the Durham boats, because Washington's going to be crossing horses, wagons, artillery. These you just can't put into a Durham boat. I think this photograph, even though it's from much later than the Revolution, clearly and accurately shows how the ferries operated. And you can see, the wagon is attached to the horses. They just drive on one end and drive off the other end. You can see the ramps that go up and down at the shoreline. And this is how they're going to get the artillery across. Washington wants to cross 18 artillery pieces to confront the 6 artillery pieces of the Hessians. He wants to outnumber their cannon 3-1. And that's going to be important. Now, in the crossings, this is where the plan begins to fall apart. Putnam decides he can't really get enough guys together, so he doesn't cross. Cadwalader and Ewing run into much worse ice conditions than Washington does, so they don't get across. So Washington is the only one who gets across. And that's partly because of the nature of the river where he crosses. below Trenton, the river is tidal. Above Trenton, the river just flows consistently in one direction. So the ice forms completely differently in those portions of the river. So Washington lucked out that he was able to cross. Once he got across, he divided his army into two divisions, and they marched on Trenton. I see in this map, they're going to hit at the north end and also the southern end of Trenton. They're going to disrupt the Hessians that are trying to form up and defend the town against them. And they're going to basically force the Hessians out of the main part of town and into the areas around it. In an orchard on the right side here is where Colonel Rahl and two of his regiments are going to be defeated. Rahl mortally wounded. And then down at the southern part, down by the Mill Pond and Mill Hill, the last regiment is going to surrender. So this is relatively a short time period. By 9 o'clock, they're pretty much done with the fighting. And now Washington has to decide what to do. We know that Washington wanted to attack more places than just Trenton. He wants to get the British out of New Jersey, but he's got a problem. He's got 900 prisoners now. Well, his original plan was to ferry them across to Pennsylvania right at Trenton, the same place he had crossed his troops back in early December. But the ice, as I said before, is not going to allow him to do that. So he's going to have to march all the way back up to Johnson and McConkey's Ferry and bring his prisoners over to Newtown. And then a day or two later, he's going to send them from Newtown down to Philadelphia. And once that, then he's going to take his troops and he's going to go back to New Jersey because he still needs to get the British out of it. He needs to convince his men, whose enlistments are up on the 31st, to extend their enlistments so that he can continue using them to fight the British. And he also needs to make use of militia reinforcements because once he defeats the Hessians at Trenton, a lot of militiamen are flocking to him, seeing an opportunity to help him out and subdue the British. So Washington, once he gets back over, concentrates at Trenton, Bordentown, and Crosswicks. And I put the red dots in just so you can see the British are still in New Jersey. And now they are just a little bit separated from him. But by January 1st, Washington's army is quite different from the army that he'd had at Trenton. A number of his men have left because their enlistments were up. Some men did extend their enlistment, but he doesn't have as many Continentals as he had for Trenton. He has a lot more militia than he had before. And so his army is going to be a little heavy on the militia side. The British are going to do what Washington hoped they wouldn't, which is combine all their forces and come down to Princeton and, bring almost between 8,000 and 10,000 troops to Princeton and threaten him down at Trenton. So he's going to pull together his troops from Crosswicks and Bordentown to Trenton, and he's going to send some troops up the road towards Princeton to set up delaying ambushes. And so then on January 2nd, the British are going to attack him by leaving Princeton early in the day. And those men that Washington had sent up towards Princeton are going to set up harassing attacks to slow the British down as they get on their way to Trenton. So notice they don't get to Trenton until between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And the fighting eventually is going to focus on the one main bridge at Trenton by the grist mill and the mill pond that we saw before. When darkness comes, both armies are going to go into camp. They're going to have their fires going for heat and food. They're going to put up guards and sentries to keep an eye on the other side. And a little after midnight, Washington is going to start pulling his troops out, and they are going to take a back road up towards Princeton and leave the British Army at Trenton. The British do see that Washington is doing this, even though Washington tried to hide it, particularly with those campfires. But Cornwallis makes the mistake of assuming that the Americans are just repositioning themselves for the continuing battle the next day, not that they are absolutely leaving the area. That he doesn't see. And Washington actually chose this route so that he would be far away, enough away from the British that they wouldn't notice what he was doing. Now, this gets us to the Battle of Princeton. And this is what you're going to see at the reenactment. And I just want to give you a very, very quick overview of what you're going to see. What you see in the arrows on this map is not the battle itself. This is what Washington wanted to do at Princeton. He knew that the British had left behind about 1,500 or so troops, about the same number that he had defeated in Trenton the week earlier. And he wanted to use the Sawmill Road that you see here and hit a town from the back. He had another group that he wanted to hit from the other side, and then he was going to break off General Mercer and attack basically from the front. So he was going to have a three-pronged attack. Problem is, around 1,000 or so of those 1,500 troops in Princeton leave early in the morning and go down the main road to get down to Trenton to reinforce Cornwallis for the day's battle that they expect to take down there. So when we get to the question, why was a battle fought at Princeton? It was fought at Princeton the way it was fought, strictly by accident. Neither side really planned it out. Washington had a different plan than he wound up using, and the British had no plan at all. They were just trying to get down to Trenton. They can't see each other. It looks from these arrows like they should be able to see each other, but the terrain is bumpy enough, and there was enough foliage and that sort of thing that they couldn't see until the British troops got to the top of Cochrane's Hill on the left side there by Worth's Mill, and the Americans were on the Sawmill Road about a mile away, about 8 o'clock in the morning. The glinting sun off the metal pieces, bayonets, buckles, anything that was shiny, caught the eye of the other men, the other side. And both Washington and the British leader, Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, are going to have to make a decision. What am I going to do now that I see these troops? Well, Mahood decided to turn around and head back towards Princeton to protect the troops he'd left behind there. But he does break off 17th Regiment, which was his regiment, and a couple of other units. And he's going to go across the farm fields and try to intercept the troops that he saw. At the same time, Washington is going to break off General Mercer to go exactly in the opposite direction to try to find out who those troops were on the post road, the main road. These two bodies of troops are heading towards each other, and it's going to be a big surprise to both of them when they actually run into each other near the orchard on the William Clark farm. It's going to be a melee. It's going to be bayonets. It's going to be muskets. There's going to be reinforcements thrown in. It's going to be a real seesaw battle until Washington, who had been going up to Princeton, is notified about the nature of that battle and how it's gotten bigger than he thought. And so he's going to lead two Continental regiments into the left flank of the British Army, while some soldiers from General Mifflin on the right flank are going to hit. This means that the British are going to be hit from three sides, not in the town of Princeton, but on these farm fields where the Princeton Battlefield is today. And the famous painting of Washington leading that charge across Maxwell's Field at the British left flank. After defeating the British on the battlefield where the state park is, now they can go and do a wipe up action in Princeton, capture some of them, and some of the others escape. But they're going to take the town of Princeton, and they're going to be able to not have to encounter Lord Cornwallis when he comes up from Trenton. They're going to be out of town by then and be headed up to Morristown. So again, this is December 1776. This is before the 10 crucial days. And you see the British control. But now the blue shows what the Americans control in the state of New Jersey. And you can see that the British have been really pushed back towards Manhattan and Staten Island and Long Island, with just a few outposts still in New Jersey. So Washington really has accomplished a great deal of what he wanted to. So why was this battle so important? Well, in the words of the citizens of Annapolis, Maryland, wrote to made an address to General Washington in December of 1781. This is after the siege of Yorktown. And they say to him, "We derive particular pleasure from the contemplation that the successes at Trenton and Princeton laid the cornerstone for our freedom and independence, and that the capture of Earl Cornwallis and his army has completed the edifice and secured the Temple of Liberty to us and our posterity. These brilliant and important events are the more agreeable to every American from the reflection that they were planned by and executed under the immediate command of your excellency." So Washington has saved the revolution with the Battle of Princeton. He also in many ways has saved his own reputation and his ability to continue as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Anybody who had doubts about him before this, those doubts have been pretty much scratched. So I hope I've given you a little introduction to the battle that you're going to see reenacted, and you'll be able to have a good understanding of why it took place where it did on the day that it did, and also appreciate the very significance of that action. And with that, I will turn it back to Will.
Thanks so much, Larry. We want to just thank Larry and the Princeton Battlefield Society, who has put in an enormous amount of work for the reenactment. For those of you who are joining us on the morning of January 2nd, buckle in. It's going to be one heck of an event. You'll get the answers to so many questions that you may have about the presentation you just heard, and you'll get to hear stories from reenactors on both sides, from historians who are intimately familiar with the 10 crucial days in the Battle of Princeton, and it will certainly be worth your time to come out. For those of you who can't join us, we openly invite you to come and visit us in the new year. Clark House and Princeton Battlefield State Park have a lot of very interesting and exciting events and programs planned for 2022. It is the 250th anniversary of the Clark House, so we'll be looking forward to celebrating our building here's 250th birthday this year, among many other things. And so we thank you. Have a happy and safe and healthy holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you on January 2nd.